Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my process for creating a simple watercolor landscape. This one is going to be awesome for those of you getting started with watercolor because we're going to get to practice the three main watercolor washes: the flat wash, the graded wash, and the variegated wash in an actual little painting. And I've included, as you can see, my thumbnail sketching process that I like doing when I'm going to be creating a landscape piece from imagination, so that I can decide on my composition and I can do at least a couple of thumbnails and then choose the one that I like most for my final piece. So having said all this, let's go ahead and jump straight into the process. The reason why I decided to film this process and share this with you today is not only because taking time to create quick thumbnails before getting started with your painting process will make your outcome be a lot more effective overall and make the process go a lot more smoothly, but also because in this particular case, I am not using a specific reference photo or photos to work from. I actually created this composition from my imagination. So right here, I am just quickly sketching out a couple of different ideas for my landscape in my sketchbook using an HB pencil, and then I'm going over it with an 8B pencil. It doesn't really matter what pencil you use for this. These thumbnails are for you so that you can deconstruct what you're going to be doing and start thinking about the different layers that you're going to be creating, the values that you're going to be developing, and the overall process that you're going to work through, which is going to lead to a much better looking painting. And it's also a great time for you to start bringing in your knowledge of art fundamentals like perspective, how you're going to be creating a sensation of depth, of your overall compositional arrangement, how you're going to be creating a sense of balance and harmony in your piece, etc. So as I am integrating all of these different elements into my little picture here, I am making sure to bring in what I know about depth and perspective, making sure that the trees that are closer to the viewer are larger than the trees in the middle ground and in the far away distance. And also, for example, if I integrate anything like a road or a river, I want to make sure that I'm integrating what I know about linear perspective, and I make sure that the parts that are receding away from us get smaller and smaller and smaller until they disappear into the distance. Another thing that I always make sure to do when I am designing my own little landscape is I always start with my horizon line. So the horizon line, if you're not sure what it is, it's the horizontal line that divides the ground from the sky, or the sea from the sky in a seascape. In this case, because I am integrating mountains into this composition, the mountains are right above the horizon line. Something that I always make sure to do when I am placing my horizon line is I never, ever, ever cut my visual compositions right in half. The horizon line is basically our eye level as the viewer of this particular setting. I don't want to cut my visual composition into halves either vertically or horizontally, and because I know that the horizon line is a very important part of landscapes, I make sure to place it either lower than the actual halfway point of this little space that I am working with, or higher up. When it comes to drawing or painting a landscape, I always like giving thought to how I can create an asymmetrical balance. So as I'm sketching out these thumbnails, I am thinking of the placement of the different elements throughout the piece, and I'm already even starting to think about how I'm going to be developing different values and different levels of detail or texture to bring in higher or lower levels of visual weight as I'm actually moving through the painting process later on. And the very last thing that I wanted to make sure to mention before getting into the painting supplies for the piece that we're going to be working on is whenever it is that you're painting a landscape that is meant to look believable, or you're drawing or painting anything natural, not man-made, make sure that you have irregularity in mind. Irregularity in terms of everything, in terms of placement, in terms of value, in terms of detail, in terms of width, length, shape, everything, okay? Stay away from creating stark looking shapes or lines. Stay away from creating very similar looking trees or mountains that look like stamps, and any sort of very organized pattern, because it's not gonna look natural. Imperfection and irregularity are very important when you're trying to create a believable looking natural setting. All right, so I finished up my 2 quick little thumbnails. I chose the one on the right, and right there you're seeing me basically plan where I'm gonna be using my flat wash, where I'm gonna be using my graded wash, and where I'm gonna be using my variegated wash. All right, so moving on to my watercolor painting supplies that I'm gonna be using today. In terms of the paper, I'm gonna be using my Arches hot press 140-pound watercolor paper. We're gonna be using a total of 4 colors today to paint this entire landscape. I am taking 1 half pan out from my Winsor & Newton Cotman Line half pan set, which is the cerulean blue. Cerulean blue is a light blue that works beautifully for blue skies. And aside from the cerulean blue, I am using 3 different colors from my St. Petersburg White Nights full pan paint set, and they are lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and green. I'm gonna be using 3 paintbrushes. The first one is my large mop brush in size 6 from Princeton, which is gonna be super helpful in pre-wetting large areas before dropping in my pigment. And I have 2 round brushes from Royal and Langnickel's Watercolor Zen line set in sizes 14 and 6. I highly recommend having a larger brush on hand for this one, because when we're painting landscapes, whether we are going to be pre-wetting large areas or we're trying to lay down a wash to cover a large area, larger brushes just are super handy. Trying to cover a large area with a small brush is most likely going to lead to marks and splotchiness, things drying way too fast, etc. So whether you have a larger mop or round brush or a flat brush, like for example, my 1-inch flat brush could perfectly do for this as well. Just make sure that you pick your paintbrushes wisely for the piece on hand. As you can see, I have taped my watercolor paper down onto my green cutting mat with regular old masking tape, and all I made sure to do was run my pieces of masking tape over my clothes a couple of times to soften that adhesive before actually taping it down, so that I don't have any problems with damaging my paper at the end when it comes time to remove it. And finally, the other painting supplies that I always make sure to have on hand are my scrap piece of watercolor paper so that I can test out colors and transparencies before actually using them in my painting. My blue absorbent towel is an absolute must. We're not only going to be using it to create our clouds in this piece, but it's always useful to have an absorbent towel on hand when we're painting with this medium, because we're constantly removing excess water and paint from our paintbrush bristles as we're moving along, and we're also able to very quickly absorb excess water or paint that we have accidentally laid down on our painting. And finally, of course, I have my little jar of clean water, which we have to make sure to change constantly throughout the painting process. All right, so the very first thing that I am going to do is I am going to create my outline sketch very lightly using my thumbnail that I have already created on my sketchbook. And I'm going to be using an HB pencil for this. You can see how I am creating my preliminary outline sketch very lightly, because I don't like my pencil lines showing through my paint. And this will also help ensure that I won't leave any excess graphite on my watercolor paper, which could lead to muddying up my vibrant colors. It's also very important that we don't scratch our watercolor paper, because those scratches are going to be visible at the end. As always, when it comes to my outline sketches, I work from general and make my way towards specifics and details, and I keep everything very simple, just with the main shapes in, and everything else is going to be developed during the painting process. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our color mixtures. The very first thing that I do before going into my paint with my paintbrushes is prepare them by gently swiveling them around my water. Allow your paintbrush bristles to soak up some of that water so that you can very easily go into your paint pan, swivel it around in there and activate your paint and bring it onto your paint mixing palette. As we're preparing these preliminary color mixtures, have in mind that this is not all of the paint that we're going to be using for our entire painting process. Working with watercolors is very fluid, and we're going to be constantly preparing more color mixtures along the way, shifting the ratios when it comes to the different colors in the color mixtures, as well as the amount of water in the color mixtures, etc., as needed along the way. But we do want to make sure that we have enough paint to start with, especially because we're working on a landscape today. And so we are doing washes in larger areas. We want to make sure that we don't run out as we're creating those washes. So I decided to start by preparing my blues. I am preparing a mixture of cerulean blue plus some ultramarine blue to darken it a bit. And then in the other well next to it, it's just plain cerulean blue. And these are blues that we're going to be using for our sky area. In this landscape that I have planned, there is also going to be a lake, and so we're also going to be using blues in the lake area. However, for the lake, I also am going to be preparing a blue that is darker and has a little bit of green because I wanted to reflect the green elements around it. All right, so as you can see, I have created quite a bit of blue. It's a nice and juicy color mixture. It's very pigmented, but it also has a bit of water in there. When I am creating my preliminary color mixtures, I always love testing them out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper to make sure that I have a pretty good idea as to how I'm going to be attacking my different color mixtures throughout the painting process. It really helps me avoid accidents and unwanted colors. All right, so after I have created my darker blue and my lighter blue color mixture, I am now moving on to the second most important color in this landscape, which is, of course, the greens. So I am creating a lighter green by mixing together this beautiful, vibrant, deep, dark green from my St. Petersburg White Nights paint set with my lemon yellow. And you can see right there the bright and vivid green that I have created with these two colors. And after that, I create a medium green by also mixing together these two colors, but with a little less lemon yellow than the previous lighter one. And in my other well, that is just the pure dark green right out of the pan with no other color mixed in. So I have a light green, a medium green, and a dark green. And I'm going to be creating another green, and this green is going to have ultramarine blue mixed into it. And I want to explain why I am creating this green. So I'm not sure if you have heard of aerial perspective before. Aerial perspective is a technique often used by landscape artists and artists who paint settings, large open areas, and it allows them to create a believable sensation of open space and depth. It's quite easy to do and very, very effective in creating that sensation of depth. So basically, if you divide your landscape into a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and make sure that you're using cooler, lighter, and less saturated colors in the faraway distance when compared to the colors that you're using closer to the viewer, this is really going to enhance the illusion that those elements in the faraway distance are farther away. So as I am preparing my different color mixtures for my landscape, and specifically giving thought to the mountains in the distance, I have two in my sketch, I'm going to be creating colors that are different for my two mountains. I want to make sure that I make that green for the mountain farthest away from us cooler than the mountain that is closer to us. So all I do is I add a little bit of ultramarine blue into that green to cool it a bit. And when I am actually painting in that mountain, I'm going to make sure that that color mixture has more water in it so that the value is lighter. And this is going to make that mountain look farther away from us than the first mountain that is closer to us. You can see right there how I've created a blue-green, and then I just have to make sure that when I paint in that mountain, I add a little bit of water into it so that it's nice and translucent when compared to the other mountain, which I want to be more saturated. Another key tip that can really help you achieve a sensation of depth in your landscapes is adding more detail and sharpness to the elements closer to the viewer than to the elements in the middle ground and in the background. So think of creating more sharp looking details in the things that are closer to us, and then add less and less detail as those things are receding away from us. This doesn't mean that you want to be thinking of adding detail since the beginning of your painting process, because in the beginning you should be thinking of creating those larger spaces, those larger washes. And then in subsequent layers, that's when you start darkening the values and developing details. Always, 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 when you're creating a drawing or a painting, think of working from general and making your way towards specifics. All right, so right here what I am doing is I am pre-wetting my sky area. I am really taking my time with it, and I'm making sure not to leave any puddles and making sure to arrive at a nice even sheen. I even like allowing my paper to absorb the water a tiny bit before actually starting to drop in my color. I use my larger mop brush for this. You can also use something like a 1-inch flat brush if you don't have a larger round brush. So my plans for the sky are to create a graded wash in which the darker blue is on the top, and then it gets lighter and lighter and lighter as I am moving down towards the horizon line. I am using only one color mixture for this graded wash, which is the mixture that we created with our cerulean blue plus ultramarine blue. I went into this very juicy and saturated color mixture with my mop brush, absorbed quite a bit of it, and as you can see, I am starting at the top and making my way down. I am a big fan of creating the 3 washes on wet paper as opposed to on dry paper. It just gives me a lot more freedom. The paper dries a lot more slowly, which leads to the paint beautifully and easily dissipating into the wetness of the paper, which leads to less marks because the paper starts to dry very fast. And if you're trying to create a gradual transition and you don't want any marks in between your different values, then pre-wetting the paper is really helpful for this. So I only loaded my paintbrush once. This particular paintbrush, as I was mentioning before, is able to absorb a lot of color mixture in its bristles, so it is going to depend on the specific brush that you're using. But I only loaded my paintbrush once. I placed my most saturated color along the top of the paper, and then I removed some of the paint from my paintbrush bristles by gently swiveling it around my water and scraping the excess water from my paintbrush bristles alongside the jar of water, and then going back in and distributing that pigment along the wider area. So as you can see, I am left with a soft transition, and you can see the darker blue along the top and how it's getting lighter as it's moving down. I intentionally avoided having this graded effect turn into completely white at the bottom because we're gonna be pulling up some clouds. So this is a very easy way of creating the illusion of clouds. All I am doing is using my absorbent towel. You can do this with a regular kitchen paper towel if you'd like. And I am pressing down on my paper. My absorbent towel is lifting up some of that color. And you can see how I am left with very beautiful, natural, irregular looking clouds. You can pull up as many or as little clouds as you'd like. Just make sure that you have in mind what I was talking about in the beginning of this video. Make sure that you have irregularity and asymmetry in mind as you're doing this. You don't want to create any stamp-looking clouds or any patterns. You also want to make sure that you don't overdo it because you want to make sure that there's still a lot of blue in your sky. I would recommend to lift up some of that paint and then step back a couple of seconds because that pigment and that water is going to continue to move a tiny bit to soften out. And you're going to notice how it changes along the way as it's drying. All right, so I'm going to go quiet for a bit as I continue working on this sky. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how the sky is looking. I have created the illusion of clouds, and through the clouds, you can see that graded transition from darker blue at the top to lighter blue at the bottom. So we've kind of combined the graded wash technique with this cloud lifting technique with our absorbent towel. All right, cool. So when it comes to painting landscapes, I pretty much, doesn't matter which medium I am using, I always work from background to middle ground to foreground. Now, because we're working with watercolor and because watercolor dissipates and bleeds into the wetness of the paper, I can't really work on my mountains right now unless I am looking for that kind of effect, which could definitely work, but that's not what I'm going for in this particular case. So I need to allow my sky to dry completely before working on the mountains. Because if I go in and start pre-wetting the mountains right now, that blue pigment is gonna start bleeding into the dampness of the paper. So I need to step back and allow that area to dry, and I need to jump to somewhere else. So I decide to work on the greens in the middle ground, and the middle ground is where I'm gonna be using my variegated wash. The wash in which one color turns into another color. And for this area, we have already created our different greens. We have created a very light and yellowish, vibrant green and also darker greens. So in these areas, I'm gonna have my different greens intermixing with each other, creating gradients into each other. So the very first thing that I do, I am still using my larger mop brush, and I made sure to remove all of the previous pigment from its bristles. And I am pre-wetting this entire area as well as that bottom little part that is also going to be green in a very uniform way, making sure that I'm not leaving any puddles. One way to make sure that you've pre-wetted everything very evenly is to turn your watercolor paper up towards the light if you have a window or something like that, wherever it is you're working in, and make sure that there is a nice and even glistening in all of this area that you're going to be painting. When you're bringing in your water, make sure that your paintbrush isn't dripping. Try to stay in control of the amount of water that you have in your paintbrush bristles as well as on your sheet of watercolor paper. Once everything has been nicely and evenly pre-wetted, I start dropping in my green pigment, starting from my light green and making my way towards the dark greens. I always love working from lighter values and making my way towards my darker values. It doesn't matter whether I'm using wet on wet techniques or wet on dry techniques or what subject it is I am painting with this medium. This doesn't mean that you have to work from lighter colors to darker colors, because that is a completely different story. For example, if I am painting something that has yellows, blues, and reds, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to start with my yellows and then my reds and then my blues. No. Just make sure that whatever area it is you're painting, work your way from lighter values of that color to darker values of that color. Color and value are two very different things. And depending on the effects that you want for the painting on hand, you have to give thought to the order of the areas that you're going to be painting or the layers that you're going to be developing on each area. So whatever area it is I decide to start painting, I always start from lightest values of the color and move on to darker values. This allows me to start thinking of creating a variation in terms of transparency and saturation in whatever area it is I am painting. That variation, I have repeated it time and time again in my past watercolor tutorials. That variation is absolutely essential if you want to make something look realistic, because you don't want any area of your painting to be flat and heavy. And when we're working from a reference, whether it's a photograph or something that we have right in front of us in real life, we're able to perceive the different values present. We're able to see the highlights, all of the midtones, and the darks. And we're able to translate that into our drawing or our painting to make it look three-dimensional and realistic. But in this case, we're working from our imagination. And so I have to make sure that I am consciously thinking of creating a believable light situation by developing a wide range of values and colors. All right, so right here, as you can see, I created my initial layer of lighter green and I am starting to drop in darker green only in certain areas. It's important that you don't cover up your previous lighter green because, as I was mentioning before, what we're going for here is variation, is creating a dimension to this area. And if we start mindlessly painting this area as if it were a wall of a house, we're going to flatten everything out. So you need to create that variation in color, in transparency, in all of the areas of your painting, really. So in this particular area, if you remember with the sketch that I created, the thumbnail, I planned for these green areas to be the areas in which I am making use of variegated wash. What this means is that one color is gradually and seamlessly turning into another color because I'm placing them beside each other on a wet surface, which is going to make them bleed into each other. What I did right there just a moment ago was to play with color a little bit more in this area. I created more of my lightest green by adding in even more lemon yellow into my light green color mixture, and I started dropping in this very light and vibrant and bright green in the area near the horizon line. As you can see right there, I used my absorbent towel once again to lift some pigment up from some areas and provide a little bit more dimension and texture into this area. As you can see, I am keeping the lightest green in the far away distance closer to the horizon line, and I am using my darker green closer to us in the area in the middle ground. This said, I am making sure to keep everything nice and irregular. I don't want things to seem too organized or drawn out. All right, so I allowed everything to dry completely and I am now going in and starting my work on the mountains. So because it's useful to start with the layer furthest away from us, I decided to get started with the mountain that is further away. And if you remember, when we were preparing our color mixtures, we created our bluish green by mixing together a bit of ultramarine blue into our green and making it a little bit cooler. If you need to create more of this color or it has dried on your color mixing palette and you need to reactivate it with some water, you can go ahead and do that at any point in time. You can also use your scrap piece of watercolor paper to test it out as much as you need to before actually going ahead and painting with it. Once I prepared enough color mixture for this mountain, I am pre-wetting this area with clean water and my large mop brush. Now, I am going to be using the flat wash technique to paint in this mountain, which means that I am going for a flat, uniform value and color all throughout this area. As with all of the washes that I explained in the last tutorial, we can do this either on wet paper or dry paper, but I personally prefer to do it on wet paper. I find it a lot easier to create a completely flat and uniform wash because when we are trying to create a flat wash on dry paper, the moment that we lay down that brush stroke, it's already starting to dry and that edge can be left visible if we're not working very fast. So by pre-wetting our paper, we can work a little bit more slowly and we can rest assured knowing that the paint is gonna automatically start dissipating and softening and not creating hard visible edges. I also feel like you have more time to move that pigment around a bit until you arrive at a uniform look. However, as I was mentioning in the last tutorial, it's important to, at some point, just leave things be, especially when it comes to watercolor, because remember that wet paper is fragile paper, and we never want to get to a point at which we're overworking it or damaging it in any way. When it comes to working with watercolor, there is a certain point at which even if things don't turn out exactly the way you were intending them to, you need to take a step back and leave things be, allow them to dry, embrace irregularity, and then later on, once the paper has dried and regained its strength, then you can consider if it's necessary to go back in and fix certain things. Okay, so as you can see, I used my bluish green and I am using it in a very watered down state because, as I was mentioning in the beginning of this tutorial, I am making use of aerial perspective. I want to make sure that the values that I create in the elements that are farther away from us are lighter than the values that I use for the elements closer to us to really enhance that illusion of open space and depth. So I painted this mountain in very lightly. As you can see, I have created a flat, uniform look. And because watercolors tend to dry lighter than how they look when they're wet, I may have to come back in later with another flat wash of color, but later on we can come back and evaluate that. All right, so one quick thing that I wanna make sure that I don't forget to mention here before moving on is if you roll back the tape a couple of seconds, you're gonna notice that I made sure to pick up the excess beads of water along the edges of the mountain that I just painted. I picked up the little beads of water that were on the masking tape right along that edge there. And this is super important because if you leave that excess water there, you're gonna create little back runs because this excess water that is left behind is going to disturb the paint that is drying. And you don't want those back runs and splotchiness along the edges of that mountain. And for this, you can either use your absorbent towel or use the bristles of your paintbrush because watercolor paintbrushes are made to absorb the water, and you can totally use it as a sort of sponge by running those bristles along that edge of your paper. Okay, so after I had finished that mountain in the faraway distance, it's time to allow it to dry. And as you can see, I jumped on over to another section. This is the area in the foreground, so closest to the viewer. And what I am doing here after I had pre-wetted this area with clean water is, like always, I started by dropping in my lightest green, and I am now adding in dimension by dropping in darker greens in certain areas. So in other words, I am kind of making use of the variegated wash once again. And I recommend just dancing around with your paintbrush, using your paintbrush in different angles, in different ways, being very organic with this. Allow the paint to do its own thing as you're dropping it in, and make sure that you're keeping everything very irregular, very organic. As you can see, I am constantly blotting the bristles of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel, especially when I am using this mop brush, because when you're using larger brushes like this one, it can be very easy to start losing control of your water and start accidentally dropping in way too much water on paper that is already wet, and you can start creating splotchiness and back runs and effects that you weren't intending to create. So be careful with that, and if you ever see that too much water or pigment is being deposited on your watercolor paper, just immediately stop doing what you're doing and blot the bristles of your paintbrush, blot your watercolor paper if needed, and go back in with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush and redistribute that pigment along a wider area. As long as the paint is still wet, you can still move it around. Just remember to keep things light, embrace irregularity and even imperfection, and leave things be. Find joy in watching how the colors intermix and what happens as the paint is drying, and really make sure that you are keeping variation in mind. Making sure that you are developing different values, different amounts of transparency and color throughout each area. Right there, I am once again using my absorbent towel to pick up some pigment in some areas and give this part more dimension. Once I'm done with that, it's time to allow that area to dry completely, and I'm now going to get to work on the mountain that is closest to us. So for this one, I'm going to be using color mixtures that contain green and lemon yellow. And what I am doing right here, still using my larger mop brush to pre-wet this entire area. After having swiveled my paintbrush around in my water a bit and made sure that I removed the pigment from its bristles, I am just going ahead and pre-wetting this area with water. Once again, I am taking my time with this process, making sure that I am not leaving any puddles behind, that I am creating a nice uniform sheen, and even allowing my paper to absorb this water a tiny bit before actually depositing my pigment. I'm gonna go quiet for a bit as I continue pre-wetting this area. All right, so I'm done with the pre-wetting process and I am loading up my brush with my green color mixture. And because this green color mixture already contains quite a bit of water in it and there is water already on my paper, I am quite sure that it's gonna lead to a light looking green, even though this dark green is darker than the green color mixture that contains the yellow in it. Especially if I only load my paintbrush once with this color and then move that pigment around, distribute it along a wider area, that's gonna lighten its value. And so I am working from lighter values to darker values, but I do end up adding in the lighter, brighter green that contains the yellow in it, just to brighten things up a bit. Because the thing here is, with this particular area, I really want this mountain to look different in terms of both color and value from the mountain behind it. So for this mountain, I ended up using a very watered down version of my pure green color mixture. So my green color mixture that only contains green and water, as well as my lighter green color mixture that does contain some lemon yellow in it. So this just goes to show that even though I do have a general way of doing things, I like working from lights and make my way towards darks, there is a flexibility involved depending on what you see happening throughout the painting process. Okay, so I am done with the initial layer of color in this closer mountain, and I am now going to switch my water. I need to make sure that my water is nice and clean because it's pretty murky at this point. In order for me to move on to the blues in my lake. So I went ahead and did that, and then before actually pre-wetting this area with clean water, I am making sure that I have my blue color mixtures prepared. So as I was mentioning in the beginning of this video, when we were preparing our preliminary color mixtures, we are going to be using a color mixture that has cerulean blue and ultramarine blue in it, as well as another one that only has cerulean blue in it. And in some areas of this lake, we're also going to be adding in a blue that has a lot of green in it so that it can look like it's reflecting the green elements around it. So that's what I'm doing right there in the well in the corner on the bottom right. I am preparing a color mixture with green and ultramarine blue. Now, if you remember, we already used the same combination of colors in the far away mountain. So if for some reason you still have some of that color mixture on your paint mixing palette, then by all means you can go ahead and use that. It's really going to depend on how much of the color mixtures you still have, how you are moving along personally. If you at any point in time need to create more of whatever color mixture it is you need, then go ahead and create more of it. Because we have pre-selected our colors that we're using for our painting, we know exactly what colors we need to add into our color mixtures at any given point in time. It's one of the benefits of pre-selecting our colors and making sure that we are sticking with the same group of colors throughout the entire painting process. We're able to stay a lot more organized with our color mixing. Now, don't get too fussy or perfectionist about the ratio of your colors in your color mixtures. By all means, if you need to test your colors and make them look very similar to the one you were previously using for a specific place, then you can go ahead and take more time creating that specific ratio that you were using before, and test it out as much as you need to on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually going into your painting with it. All right, so after having pre-wetted this lake area, I started out by laying down my initial layer of color using pure cerulean blue with water, and I am now adding in my second darker blue, which is a mixture that has cerulean blue and ultramarine blue. I finally switched on over to a smaller round brush. I am now using my size 14 round for this. When I am painting water, I do like making sure that I leave very light areas, including some highlights in which the paper is shining through completely. Once I have created my initial layer of very light blue and I have deposited some darker blue in some areas, I am now going in and starting to drop in my blue-green. And this is a color that I am only keeping along some of the edges of the lake. Do make sure, once again, that you are not making anything seem too drawn out and keeping things very irregular. So as you can see, this green is dissipating into the blues, making everything very organic and natural looking. Right there, I am just doing a little bit of lifting with my absorbent towel and using my clean paintbrush to absorb some of that pigment and move it around a tiny bit before adding another wash of darker and more intense blue and more intense green as well. So what I did there was I created more of my cerulean blue plus ultramarine blue color mixture, and this is even more saturated than the one that I was previously using, which means that it has more pigment in it and less water. Remember that in order to darken colors when it comes to watercolor, all you need to do is add more paint and use a less amount of water. Remember that we're going darker and darker, which means that we're using less and less water as we go. And because at this point, this area of our paper is already wet, we need to have in mind that that color that we have in our paint mixing palette is likely not going to look as saturated once it has dissipated into the water. So I start placing this darker and more saturated blue only throughout some areas, making sure that there is still a lot of the previous lighter blue shining through. And then I create more of my blue-green color mixture, but this time I make sure to place a lot more green in it because I noticed that the previous color mixture that I created is barely visible at all. Once it had dissipated into the blue, it's barely visible. So I made sure to make this color mixture even more green, and now, as you can see, it's a lot more visible. After I had placed a good amount of that green color on my watercolor paper, I removed the excess water and paint from my paintbrush bristles, and I move that pigment around as I see fit. I then jump on to the lower edge of my lake and I do the exact same thing. I place some of that very deep and saturated blue-green, and I remove all of the pigment and water from my paintbrush bristles and go back in and distribute that pigment around, soften those edges a bit. All right, so I can tell that I'm really arriving at a point at which I need to allow this area to dry completely if I want to do anything else to it. I have been working on this area way too long. So I'm just gonna do a tiny bit of softening out and lifting with my brush and my absorbent towel. And we're gonna switch on over to working on the faraway mountain in the distance, which I can already tell that it dried to a very, very light value. And I can barely tell the difference in value between the faraway mountain and my sky. So I decided that I'm gonna go back in with another flat wash just to darken that value a tiny bit more. Now, you may or may not have to do this yourself. If you can tell the difference in values between this faraway mountain and your sky, and it looks good to you, then by all means, leave it the way it is. There are so many variables that come into play when painting with this medium that can affect how your painting process is moving along. So I'm gonna leave this decision up to you. So I created more of my blue-green color mixture, and I am now going to use it in a much more saturated way. As you can see, after I did that, I am now pre-wetting this background mountain in the distance using clean water and my larger mop brush. And if you notice, I left the top right edge of my mountain dry. And I did this intentionally because I want that part of the mountain to be lighter in value than the flat wash that I'm going to be creating in the lower part. This way I can create a little bit of a light effect, even though I'm going to be using a flat wash in the bottom. So I am doing the exact same thing that I did with the previous wash, and I am depositing my pigment all throughout this pre-wetted area and moving the pigment around until I arrive at a nice uniform look. If your paper starts warping or buckling, it can be difficult to create a flat wash. So what I did right there was I actually used the bristles of my paintbrush to soak up some excess paint that was pooling in some areas. You can see how I am blotting the bristles of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel and going back in to soak up excess paint and water from my painting and redistribute that pigment in a more uniform way along this area. Once that's done, I have to make sure to absorb the excess water that has collected along the edges of my masking tape to make sure that I don't accidentally create any backgrounds in that area. And then what you're gonna see me do right there is I switch on over to my size 6 round brush and I run my bristles along the edge of this new blue-green shape that we've created. This is going to help soften the transition between the two colors, and I am now going in to do some lifting with my clean and almost dry paintbrush bristles, as well as with my absorbent towel to add more dimension to this flat wash that we've just created. I decided to do this just to add a little bit of tonal variety in this mountain because it is surrounded by all of these elements that have had a lot of different values and transparencies already developed in them, and it's looking a little bit out of place. All right, so we are done with this mountain right here, and we are officially done with all of the initial washes and layers of color all throughout the large elements in our painting. And so this means that it is time to get started with the smaller details. We're keeping this landscape nice and simple, and we're only going to be adding some trees and some grass textures here and there. So what I am doing is I am creating a medium green to start with. I want to make sure that I have a nice variety of greens already mixed in my color mixing palette so that I can start creating those trees. I'm going to be painting in my trees with a scribbling technique, but I want to make sure that I start with a lighter and more translucent green. And while that paint is still wet, I'm going to be dropping in darker green values. I know that it can be quite scary to start adding in the trees, especially the larger ones that we're going to be creating in the foreground. So if you don't have practice or don't feel confident enough with your tree painting, I would highly recommend creating some tree studies before actually adding them into your painting. To paint in my trees and other smaller details, I switched on over to the smallest round brush that I prepared for this painting process, which is a size 6. And the technique that I like using to paint in these evergreen trees is a mixture between scribbling and bouncing. These are two types of brush strokes that I talk about in a past tutorial that I shared a while back, which I'll make sure to link to down below in the text section of this post. And all I am doing is visualizing that general triangular shape of those evergreen trees, and I'm making my way from top to bottom, going back and forth, left to right, then right to left, using just the tip of my paintbrush, especially for these very small trees that are in the faraway distance. In the trees that are closest, I can press down the belly of my brush a little bit more if I want to, lifting up and down from my paper while simultaneously moving from side to side. This helps me create very irregular, abstract shapes and helps me make sure that I'm leaving little teeny tiny sections of paper unpainted with just the background or the grass areas showing through. I don't want to create very heavy, triangular, blocky shapes. There has to be a lot of irregularity here. And I did make sure to start with a more translucent, watered down version of my medium green. And then once that was painted in, I allowed it to partially dry. And then I went in with a slightly darker, more saturated green so that I could develop at least a couple of different values and a light and shadow effect in these trees. The reason why I like leaving my trees for after I have already created my large washes of color is because it makes the trees look a lot more natural, because usually in real life, we're able to see through the leaves of the trees and we're able to see part of the background behind the trees. And if we had left the entire area where we would be adding in the trees white with no color in there, it would have been very, very difficult to paint the areas around the trees in those little tiny nooks and crannies created by the irregular, very organic shape that we've just created with our scribbling. Not to mention, the areas in between the leaves of the trees would have been very difficult to paint. Also, because I knew since the beginning that the greens that I would be using for my trees were going to be much darker overall than the greens behind them, these green colors would not be affected by the colors behind them, even though we are using translucent paint. So that's something that is very important to consider. Watercolor is a translucent or transparent medium, which means that the previous layers of color that we have laid down are going to have an effect on the layers of color that we place on top of them. So if I were painting something that was red and I started painting something that was green on top of the red, I'm going to most likely end up with a color that I wasn't necessarily going for, especially because green and red are opposites in the color wheel. It's always super useful to test out and to acknowledge what is going to happen when you start overlapping very different colors together, because this way you can really avoid undesired accidents. And another thing to have in mind that goes hand in hand with this method of working with watercolor, which is working from lighter values or more watered down paint mixtures to darker values and less watered down paint mixtures, is that because we have started with lighter values and we are making our way incrementally towards darker and more saturated colors, the details that we place later on are going to be controlled and are going to be visible over the lighter and more translucent values. If I had just gone ahead and started right off the bat with very dark and saturated color, then it would have not only been a lot more difficult to create a wide variation in values all throughout my painting, but the details that I start placing on top of those very dark areas are really not going to be visible, and I'm most likely going to end up with a very flat and heavy looking mess. Okay, so as you can see, I am continuing to develop an illusion of grass in some areas here and there all throughout this middle ground section. I made sure to add some along the edges of the lake there, and I am keeping everything in a very irregular, non-organized way. I am also making sure to start with a light translucent green, and then I go ahead and start adding in a darker green only in necessary areas here and there. Whenever I see that I accidentally go in with a very deep and saturated green too soon, I stop what I am doing, I swivel my brush in my water, removing the pigment from its bristles. I then blot it on my absorbent towel to remove the excess water, and I go in and do very gentle side to side scribbling motions, distributing that pigment along a wider area and even picking some of it up. This will soften that stark looking shape or mark that you've created. Throughout this middle ground section, I am not actually drawing in every single little blade of grass. I'm just thinking of little organic or irregular shapes created by clumps of grass. In sections nearest us as the viewer of the scene, I will be adding in blades of grass individually, painting in individual brush strokes for those blades of grass. Okay, so that is enough for now. I don't want to overdo it with details in the middle ground area. It is finally time to get started with the largest trees in the foreground. This can be pretty scary, but if you have your practice in, then it's gonna be fine. What I do once again is I make sure to get started with a green that is not too dark yet. I'm gonna be developing the values in these trees in maybe 2 or maybe 3 layers. I'll see what happens, but always, always, always get started with your lighter value and drop in your darker value only in places where you see you need to. As you can see, I'm still using the same technique that I was using for the smaller trees in the farther away distance, making my way from the upmost tip of the tree downwards from side to side, thinking of that general triangular shape for this type of evergreen tree, and making sure that I'm keeping everything very loose, very irregular, very abstract, and making sure that I'm not creating a very heavy, blocky, solid shape. This is a triangular tree. It has an overall triangular shape, and it has those leaves that are in sort of layers. So that's what I am thinking of. That's what's in my mind as I am creating these scribbling motions. Now, when you are painting very small trees in the distance, it's very likely that you're gonna have to use only the tiny tip of your paintbrush. But the bigger your trees get closer to the foreground, then you can start actually pressing down the tip of your paintbrush a little bit more and play with the way that you're holding your paintbrush so that you can more naturally create that illusion of irregular layers of leaves. I'm actually thinking of these leaves and these layers of leaves as abstract shapes more than marks or lines or specific patterns. So right here, because I am using a smaller paintbrush, this means that I have to constantly go back and forth between my water and my paint mixture, because obviously the larger the paintbrush is, the more paint and water it's able to hold in its bristles. And so it's very likely and very normal that you're gonna have to go back and forth between your water and your paint as needed as you are painting in these trees. As you continue doing your scribbling motions and going downwards, you're probably going to start noticing that you're running out of paint and the translucency of your paint is becoming greater and greater, or it's becoming more and more transparent, which means that you're probably going to have to reload your brush. You can actually use this natural gradation that starts happening when you're working with watercolor to your advantage, because we're looking for variation, right? So even within our trees, we want to make sure that we have very light and translucent values, and we have darker values in some places. So once you start dropping in your darker green, make sure that you don't completely cover your previous green. When I start adding in my deeper and darkest green in these trees, I am thinking of where it would make sense to have shadow areas, and I keep the lighter green shining through completely in most of it. Oftentimes, it helps to look at actual tree references, so pictures of this type of tree, so that you can get a better sense of its overall structure and where the shadows naturally fall. I'm gonna go quiet as I continue working on these trees, but I do want to remind you not to overdo it with the darkest green. Make sure that you're developing a wide range of values all throughout and that you're keeping things light. Okay, so we are pretty much done with the trees. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna get to work on another layer of color throughout the lake area. So everything is completely dry at this point, and I switched on back to my mop brush, and I am pre-wetting this area with water. As you can see, the blue and green colors throughout this lake area have lightened quite a bit as the paint has dried. And I want to make sure to go back in and make those blues a little bit darker and drop more green in to really enhance that illusion of the green elements reflecting on the water. After I pre-wetted this area, I am allowing it to soak into my paper a tiny bit, and I am creating more of my ultramarine blue plus cerulean blue color mixture. And I'm going to be dropping it in a very saturated manner. Using my size 14 round brush, I start dropping in this darker blue only in some areas. In other areas, I allow the previous blue color to shine through completely. And once that's done, you're gonna see me add in a very saturated green in some areas as well. The same way that it is super helpful to look for tree references in order to make your painting look believable, it's also very useful to look at water references or sky references or whatever it is you're painting, especially when we don't have a lot of practice painting a particular thing. One of the dangers of working only from our imagination, especially when we don't have enough practice painting or drawing a specific subject, in this case a landscape, is that we tend to get used to drawing or painting something the way we think it looks like and not what it actually looks like. And another thing to have in mind is that just because you're looking for visual information in the form of a reference photo or a book or a video, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to paint it or draw it in the exact same way that you're seeing it in your reference. One of the best things that we can do, in my opinion, in order to increase the levels of realism in our work, whether it's drawing or painting, is using references. It is through developing our observational skills via actually acknowledging what things look like in real life and being able to capture those subtleties that make something look realistic, that we're going to be able to increase the level of realism in our work. And the reason why I'm even able to create these landscapes from my imagination right now is because in the past, I've created isolated studies of trees using reference photos. I've created isolated studies of mountains, of skies, of water, etc. All right, so right there, I want to show you how I lay down my pigment on dry paper and I go back in with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush and soften those hard edges out. By this point, you've probably been able to notice that all of these smaller details that I have added in have been created on paper that is already dry, which means that these details stay sharp if I don't go back in and soften edges. But you're almost always going to be able to do at least a little bit of softening, even if the paint is already dry most of the time, if you go back in and run along those edges with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush. The degree to which you're able to move paint around after it has dried is going to depend a lot on the type of paper that you're using, its quality, as well as the quality of the paint that you're using, and even the specific pigment on hand that you're using. Because something that's important to know is that different pigments, different colors, even within the same watercolor set, are going to react differently. Some pigments can be lifted more easily than others. And it's also going to depend on how quickly your specific paper that you're using absorbs or soaks up that pigment. Okay, so I am still working on developing those details, that illusion of grass in my middle ground before I get to work on the area in the foreground. I am making my way towards my darker darks incrementally and making sure that I don't darken that area in the middle ground too much because I want my darker values to be closer to us as the viewer. Okay, I'm gonna go quiet for one last time as I continue working on these greens in the middle ground area, and then we're gonna switch to working on this little grass area in the foreground. Remember that there is no need to feel that you have to describe everything, and that oftentimes when it comes to watercolor, less is more. Okay, so it's time to get to work in this area in the foreground. We are literally in the home stretch for this painting process. And as I was mentioning before, I'm gonna be actually drawing in some blades of grass throughout this area. This said, I don't want to completely cover up this area with little vertical brush strokes. And it's also very, very important that we don't go in with a very dark and saturated green right off the bat. I actually want these blades of grass to be kind of subtle. And so I want to make sure that I'm going in with a light and translucent green. I am using my smallest round brush, my size 6. And I am doing vertical brush strokes going upwards. I am making sure to make them nice and short. You don't want these blades of grass to be too long. And you also want to make sure that they are slightly curved in different directions to make them look more natural. You don't want them to be completely vertical, going straight up and down. And just like what I did with the grass in the middle ground, I am actually thinking of clumps or groups of blades of grass as I am drawing them in. And this upwards flick that you are using to create these little marks is going to create this illusion of the root of the grass being thicker and getting thinner as your little mark moves upward. It's a very useful technique for when we're drawing something like eyelashes or even fur. That variation in weight throughout your lines, having it go from thicker to thinner, or from darker to lighter, even if that variation is very, very slight, will make that mark look a lot more natural. You want to stay away from creating one continuous weight from one end of your lines to the other ends of your lines. I want to make sure that my grass isn't too stark looking and that it's nice and soft all throughout. I don't want this area to compete with the trees. I want the focal point to be the trees. And so I want to make sure that even though I am creating some amount of visible texture in this area and that this texture is more defined when you compare it to the grass in the middle ground, I want to make sure that I am not giving this area more visual weight than my trees. So I'm going to continue adding in some more blades of grass, and you're going to notice that I did not saturate this area completely because it's really not necessary. And I even go back into some blades of grass and soften them out with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush. You're probably not going to notice this though, because I simply remove the pigment from my paintbrush bristles and go back in and simply redo those same little brush strokes on top of some of those blades of grass to soften them out. So something I love right here in the foreground, for example, is how we can see the different values in the washes that we previously created through this new texture that we're adding in. This variation in values and transparencies creates a sensation of light hitting this area and gives it a lot of dimension. So I am just continuing to add my blades of grass, making sure not to overdo it. And in a tiny bit is when I start softening some of them out. Whenever I am switching to painting a new area or a new little element that I am adding in, I always give thought to how I can vary the way that I am using my paintbrush to better transmit the illusion of that thing that I am trying to paint, because one same paintbrush can be used in so many different ways. When I was first getting started with watercolor, I fell into the trap of thinking that I would have to buy all of these different types of paintbrushes, including like a fan brush and an angled brush and a detailing brush and all of these different things. And the fact of the matter is that round brushes and flat brushes are the most versatile of all. And if you have a few different sizes of both of these kinds of brushes, you can pretty much paint like every single subject imaginable. If you like to paint larger paintings or need to cover up larger areas faster, simply buy larger round brushes and larger flat brushes. And if you like working on smaller pieces and adding in very small details, then just buy smaller rounds and flats. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the level of detail and grass texture in this little area in the foreground. And just to finish up this painting, I'm going to add another layer of green in the mountain that is closer to us. So I want to liven up that green a tiny bit. And to do this, I am pre-wetting this mountain with my larger mop brush. And I'm going to be adding just a little bit of brighter greens here and there. So I added just a tiny bit of lemon yellow into my green color mixture. I tested it out on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, and then I started dropping it into certain areas. You're going to notice how I stay away from those areas of highlights within this mountain. I want to make sure that I keep those areas protected throughout the entire painting process. We talked about how important it is when we're working with watercolor to protect those lightest areas, which is quite difficult to do when we're just getting started. It took me a while to get used to it. I do a little bit of lifting with my absorbent towel. I add even more lemon yellow into my color mixture and brighten up some areas even more. And then to finish up this painting, I decide to go into the area in the foreground one last time. Everything is completely dry at this point. So I pre-wet this area completely, and what I do is I start dropping in these lighter greens that I have just used for my mountain in the distance. And my objective with this is simply to add more dimension and vibrancy to this part of my picture. So after I pre-wet everything, I add even more lemon yellow into my green color mixture so that it's nice and bright. And once again, I start with lighter values and make my way towards darker values. And because all of the previous layers of paint, both the washes that we created initially as well as the grass texture, were completely dry before I pre-wetted this area again, they are not going to move. They're still going to be visible through this wash that we're creating now. Whenever we have the desire to soften out a little shape or mark that we had already created, then we actually have to go in with a little bit of a heavier scrubbing motion. And if we allow a layer to dry completely and we come back to it after a while with another wash of color, if we have the intention of brightening it up or maybe shifting the color temperature a bit, it shouldn't move if you're very light and careful. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.